Namaste, Sriram sir. How are you?
Namaste, Aryanji. How are you? Great to be,
Welcome
part.
to India.
Thank you. Great to be part of your show, finally.
Your book, Kautilyanomics, can you show the cover? Yeah.
Yours.
So this is number 1 in economic history on Amazon, right?
Yeah.
And it's doing fantastic. I think it has already print run is over. So congratulations on the book, and a fantastic topic to choose because people have written so much about Kautilya, Chanakya, but nobody has delved deeper. I mean, couple of people have, but nobody has done extensive research on the economic part. Economist Chanakya, right?
Right.
And on top of this, he's not just an economist; he's a political economist, which makes him more important for including our politicians today who have some kind of allergy to pure economists. They also want recommendations that are politically also correct. Pure economics is not something that they can go along with. So in that regard, I think this is a wonderful work that you have done. Did you have any problem finding a publisher for this, or you had to face any problems while approaching the publishers? Because usually Chanakya is a kind of clickbait. Everybody's writing on him, but nobody understands him that much. And especially on the economic part of it, it's very difficult.
Yeah. Anyways, thank you for inviting me here. Great to be part of your studio setup. I've always liked the sort of physical interaction that your show brings. So in that sense, very happy to be part of it. Yes, the book is doing well by God's grace. First print run, I just got it on today, got over, so it's going for another run. And the reviews have been pretty good.
I think you just come closer.
Sure. And the reviews have been pretty good for the book as well. And I think, personally, I think it is more than what I expected from the book. So happy overall. But yeah, just before I begin, these are my personal views. Just want to put it on the record. Yes, of course. I think there are a lot of challenges in this book. Since you've read it, and some of your listeners might have read it. Some of them might have found the book a bit intense because it tries to cover a wide sort of range of readership. One is the sort of Indic audience, people who are interested in Indic subjects. Another is the econ audience or the finance audience. People who do econ and finance for bread and butter. And then the third audience is, people who are neither, who just want to read the book, want to understand about Kautilya, the general reader, put it that way. And the book had to cater to all the three of them. I mean, I had it in the way I had conceptualized it. I wanted it to cater to three of them. So it's a very delicate sort of challenge. So even though I had written for many publications before, so when this proposal was given to a lot of publishers, I'm talking about probably 4 or 5 years back, a lot of them wanted to dilute the subject for a variety of reasons, commercial reasons, whatever it is, to make it sort of easy to read types, But I was a bit reluctant because I felt that the audience, especially the Indic audience, are game enough for complex content, rich content. The sense that I felt was that the reader was not, was being fed subjects that were light, thinking that the reader can't sort of absorb beyond that. And so I sort of pushed back. And I felt that I needed to do justice to the subject, given that the Artha and the Arthashastra is barely dealt with, which we'll discuss a bit later, on the motivations for the book. So at some point when publishers were telling me this, I decided this is how I'm going to structure the book. And If they like it, fine. If they don't, I'm just going to go ahead and probably self-publish myself and then figure a way out. Because my primary focus was to do justice to the subject and then cover these three audiences which I spoke about within this book. Because eventually you want to get a material which has analytical rigor. And you want to have a material which is, has deep thought. And there's a lot of analytical sort of, backbone to it, put it that way. Right? So you don't want to come across as something which is, sort of flying the kites type, which we don't want to do. And there is no need to do because there's a lot of material. So I was conscious of that attempt. And so I sort of, after a point, I decided to do this. And then luckily, at some point, Bloomsbury came along, and credit to Praveen Tiwari, who's been an important support for this book. He saw the vision of what I was trying to do, which is again not easy, right? Even for other publishers, I'm saying, because it's a complex topic. The output now looks good, but for you to see this much earlier was different. So, and once they were on board, I felt, I had full freedom. And eventually, though it took some time because of a lot of factors, I think eventually it came through. So overall, I think, it was a difficult exercise in terms of the publisher and aligning to what the publishers want. But eventually, I think it's worked out reasonably well.
So when you were whenever we talk about some economist, right, whoever has achieved a cult status, we study their economics, their principles, and we find that there is some underlying principle that they are trying to push, or what their theory is based on. It might be profit maximization for the state. It might be ki tax revenue badana hai. Everybody can have different motives, right? So what is the foundational principle that guides Chanakya's or Kautilya's arthashastra? तो वो अर्थ नीति जो है, what is the foundational principle that you find that this is something that this guy is basing his economic principles on?
Yeah. Before I answer this question, I also want to dwell a bit on, just to give some context, why Kautilya is important, right? I mean, there have been many kingdoms. Each kingdom would have had a strategist, and each of them would have had, some level of thinking, right? But why does Kautilya stand out, right? So when I was researching for my own, research on another subject on historical GDP data, the gross domestic product data, which we use for, our quarterly GDP that you see, yearly GDP numbers that you see. So there's a guy called Angus Maddison. He's a world-renowned economic historian. So he produced this data set for about 1,000 years, from 0 CE onwards till about 17th, 18th century. So many people talk about this, of basically how India and China were alternating in terms of GDP during this period. And a lot of people talk about it, but very few people actually go and look at the data set. So I was working on this data set, and while working on it, I sort of felt that intuitively there had to be some sort of a framework, some sort of a thinking, which sort of enabled this growth, right? So which means something before CE, right? And something which is very focused on this element of economics and finance. That's where the arthashastra comes into play. And also because it is also by a person whose empire that he sort of strategized for covered such a vast amount of land. So not only was the empire so big, but the persona of Kautilya itself was sort of so omnipresent, or, So his views take a lot of mileage. And then he's created a text which is primarily focused on the artha. The arthashastra focuses on the artha part of it. So combination of these three factors make Kautilya a very endearing sort of personality. Having said that, I think the fundamental thing that Kautilya brings to the table is the idea of dharma. Right? There are various definitions of dharma. We've debated this for many centuries. In the case of Kautilya, he believed that the role of dharma can play sort of a self-correcting mechanism, both for the state and the market. So, in simpler terms, you have the state, which basically is the government in today's terms. The government, say, invests money, infrastructure, they get taxes from you in terms of revenue, and then they do a variety of projects, they provide income support for people, they do a variety of activities to play a role in the economy. And then you have the market. The general, the financial markets, the normal, competitive markets that we see in various activities, and the market goes on its own sort of path, put it that way. The entire definition of, most of modern economics plays between these two levers. So either you have the state's influence, which is more in one philosophy, the Keynesian philosophy, for example, in very simplistic terms. The state intervenes more whenever there's a need, whenever there's a crisis, and that pumps up economic activity. And then the cycle keeps repeating. And then there is the laissez-faire approach, which basically believes that, the market itself corrects by itself, more or less, the invisible hand, as they call it, right? And the role of state should be minimal, right? But this is a binary concept between the two. I think what Kautilya really brings to the table, he puts dharma as sort of the foundation to his economic philosophy. So dharma plays a role of self-correcting both the state and the market. So he liberates the state and the market in a conceptual sort of framework. So for example, if there's corruption in the state, right? Dharma plays a role of self-correcting corruption on top of law and order. Obviously, he believed in law and order. And the role of, the Dharmic sort of components of society and enhancing those components help to reduce corruption, for example, in the state. Say there's moral hazard, which we call in the markets. That is, you are having cronyism, for example. Again, Kautilya uses the idea of dharma in terms of societal responsibilities or, components of dharma to sort of deal with that. So this idea of Dharmic capitalism, which I sort of conceptualize, not because I want to refer to capitalism, but just to contextualize the subject. I think that is something very innovative and unique that Kautilya brings to the table. I mean, in the book, I sort of narrowed the definition of dharma into ethics, responsibilities, and sort of international harmony, and then wealth creation, and a rule enforcing state, and things like that, and sustainable growth. But to answer your broader question, I think the biggest USP that Kautilya brings to the table is to sort of bring dharma as a player, not just for non-material pursuits, but for even material activities. And so what it does is, it bridges the gap between the way society on its own lives and how policymakers want to, implement policy in today's context, for example. Because there's always a gap. So this sort of helps to bridge the gap. I think that would be the single sort of biggest unique element, I think, of Kautilya's economic philosophy.
But for example, this dharma that you say, that is at the foundation of his ideology, economics. Can you illustrate it with some examples where there is some policy that he propounded and there is some dharmic principle involved in that? For example, but that you mentioned that limited state, not non-intrusive, or rule of law, all these principles that we see today and that we have taken from the Western world, they have come up with these concepts without the concept of dharma. So where what new that Chanakya has brought to the table in this regard?
Yeah, so he
Because whether you say welfare state, whether you say a non-intrusive but rule of law, state that values rule of law, all these things are available. Like without Chanakya coming into the picture.
well, that's a fair point. What we're trying to say is that the way Kautilya sort of envisioned this is that he sort of sees, the way I've defined it is he sees Dharma as three big components, right? The way it's classified. One is ethics, one is responsibilities, one is harmony and sort of an international approach. Dharma can be defined in terms of responsibilities, our Dharmic responsibilities, for example. It can be your Dharma is to do this. It can be from an ethical angle. And it can be also about the, sort of a global harmony and a Dharmic way of life, which is encompassing everyone, for example, right? Within ethics, there is also further sort of segregation, I would put it that way. In fact, now that we're on the subject, to urge your readers, page 81 in the book, this sort of, clearly shows this framework.
We can put an image also on the screen. Yeah.
Sure. So this framework, which basically, speaking on ethics, right? Within ethics, we have a clean administration, which is one component, right? And then clean institutions, another component. And then enforcement of rules, which is another component, again, of ethics. And then the driver, it also being a driver of economic growth. When you have an ethical society, people are transparent, people are honest, contracts are obliged. There's less amount of corruption, and then overall there's more opportunities for wealth creation. And the role of a clean administration, clean institutions, and the role of enforcement of rules takes you to the rule-based approach, the bigger bucket of rule-based approach, and a non-intrusive state. So what I'm trying to say is that for us, and because of the fact that we have been fed with only the modern worldview, it is obvious to us that this is how things are. But from Kautilya's point of view, it is a derivative of Dharma. That the idea of rule-based and non-intrusive state is derived from the 2-3 buckets which I just referred now, which are derived from ethics, which are derived from the idea of Dharma. So his entire philosophy, which is obvious to us, he derives all of them from the definition of Dharma itself, in my view. So I think that's how you sort of should look at it.
So in that sense, can we say that the Western societies, for example, Western states, shouldn't say societies, where there is rule of law that is stronger than India, there is enforcement of contracts. As we know, India's rank in enforcement of contracts is very poor. So in that sense, and so many other things, welfare state and other things, international trade, for example, US was the one which led from the front, Western world, to liberalize the international trade. So all those things, can we say that some of these Western states are more Chanakyan in their economics than the Indian one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interpretation you can make, like based on these principles. But you need to understand one thing, right? Let's take the idea of trade that you're talking about. The idea of international trade, or sort of if we define international trade to be equivalent to, say, globalization, or a form of globalization, right? Because globalization is a big word. Then the status quo of Bharatiya society has been, having globalization, except for the last, post.
And we didn't have anything to trade, basically.
Oh, yeah, that's
except
right.
that.
I mean, even when the British looted India, I mean, they
It was a kind of trade only.
Yeah, I mean, they took stuff out
Yeah.
through this process, right? But if you look at all the civilizations, I mean, if you look at the Mauryan Empire, you can find Roman coins in a lot of these places. You can find Chinese ambassadors writing about interactions based on trade. You even have the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, accounts of travelers talking about how majestic Bharat was at that time and how prosperous it was. And a large part of it was based on trade. Even if you come in the Common Era, whether you take the Chola Empire or whether you take the other sort of big empires during that time, I mean, the Chola Empire extended all the way till, they provided support all the way till Cambodia and Malaysia and even Indonesia, the Srivijaya kingdoms. And the Hindu kingdoms, even in Cambodia, for example, all of them were a consequence of some international movement of goods and services over a period of time. I mean, Sanjeev ji has written a lot on this. And even Angus Madison himself argues this, that the concept of international exchange of goods and services was the norm for a long period of time. So, in fact, there are accounts where people talk about Kautilya adjusting the money supply of coins and financial instruments because of changes in trade. Because of goods and services which were not available, say, from Bharat at that time, the Roman sort of empire had financial squeezes, and they had to sort of handle their balance of payments and all these things because of these dynamics. Obviously, given technology and all these things, we are at a much faster pace of understanding all this. So there was definitely lag in sort of understanding this. But at a conceptual level, you had a lot of these things happening. So to your question of this comparison, I think the question really is, which era are you comparing? Which point of, historical sort of time frame that you're comparing? But you're right. I think if you're going to mention, or if you're going to refer something as a Kautilyan state, and if, say, we agree broadly on this framework, then you should use these benchmarks to sort of evaluate where the Kautilyan sort of framework is. Because, all this while, I was told, for example, that Kautilya is sort of a, Machiavelli of his time, right? Which in my view is highly flawed, right? Kautilya is a very detailed state. The state is very detailed. It tells you, what, say, the employees in a government administration need to pay. It gives you a range of, panas from 60 panas to almost 40,000 panas. It tells you different, sectors within government administration and all these things. But it doesn't micromanage people. It doesn't tell you, for example, you can only supply, say, 10 kilos of rice, or you can only trade this many products at this point of time. So it doesn't do that, because a socialist state does that. So if you're saying that it is a sort of a socialist control state, I think that's flawed. That's wrong in my view.
Yeah, I have to ask a question on that. I will ask after this, but I also got that sense that what I'm reading, like when I read arthashastra, I thought that it will put Nehruvian state to shame. It's so nanny-like, basically, in that sense, like where the state is basically in the command and control of the economy. That is a sense once one gets after reading it, but your reading is completely different. We'll come to that. But the reason I asked for the foundational principles of Kautilyan economics, because that the situation might have changed. For example, right now our world is very different from that time, and so many conditions have changed. Money supply, all things, right? Nation state, we have the concept of sovereignty itself is very different. So while those recommendations or what he proposed might be different, but the foundational principle that we can use to come up with solutions to our problems of our times. So that was the idea behind asking that question.
Yeah. So on
And in lead to that, what would you say that there is something in Kautilyanomics that is that was good, that can still be applied today, but we are not doing it? That is the first question. Second, what is something that he recommended that we today, that some states might be applying it, but it's not good, found it's not workable for us?
okay.
Couple of examples if you can.
Okay, so I'll take the three questions. So I'll take the first part first.
Yeah.
That is, you were talking about the first part. Can you repeat that?
That we will take later, the
Okay.
nanny state kind of.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So so we will go for the one that can be used today.
Yeah.
I think the idea of welfare,
Hmm.
because Kautilya's primary focus was on the welfare of the people. So I have in fact given this presentation at IIM Bangalore for your listeners who are interested on how Kautilya dealt with inequality
Hmm.
as a separate presentation. So if your listeners are interested, they can always search the video. So he believed in sort of a targeted approach, right? So if, say, people below poverty line need food supply or need basic income, so he would target a particular group which is needed, which needs it,
Hmm.
and then gives them whatever income or whatever is required. He didn't believe in this idea of universal sort of basic transfer and things like that. Everyone gets doles or everyone gets a particular income.
Only the needy should get it.
Correct. So in that sense, I think, and he also believed in efficiency of this transfer, which means you try to reduce corruption, reduce, supply chains in all that places. And along these lines, he also believed in the idea of minimum wages, flexible minimum wages. It's a new concept again. To simplify it again for your listeners, what is a minimum wage? It's basically a particular wage that people argue that below which you cannot go in terms of giving a particular employee. So, for example, in the United States, they have $15 a minimum wage is one argument which people have been making, which means you have to give $15, say, an hour, below which you cannot, give the employees in that particular state or, say, country. So Kautilya believed in an idea of having a flexible minimum wage depending on circumstances, right? So $15 when inflation is at 7% is very different to $15 when it's at 2%. Again, because the net is $13 when it's 2%, net what comes to the person, because your 2% is going off inflation. But when it's $7, it's $8, which is what they're getting. So there's a difference between $8 and, say, $13.
That's true for like incomes also.
Correct. But so Kautilya believed in sort of a real minimum wage. So that's why he made it flexible. So when circumstances changed, his view of minimum wage is also changed.
So that's very flexible.
That is an important concept. I think that is something, if you're convinced by this idea of minimum wage, to make it sort of flexible and change it to circumstances is something, that can be valuable today. And also, say, targeted sort of schemes which are less corrupt and less efficient, more efficient and less corrupt. That is something which you could, learn from or use. One thing that what Kautilya didn't probably do well, in my view, was probably his idea of some of the punishments that he gave and how he sort of implemented some of these things could be, I would say, better designed or lesser, I wouldn't say less controversial, but
Less complex.
yeah, because
There are too many layers.
correct. So
Like there is a penalty for everything. I
Correct.
mean, it is very structured, but it's too complex.
no, but let me again push back a bit on that, because see, the arthashastra is a text, It doesn't mean that as a policy maker in Kautilya's time, he's going to use everything in the arthashastra as law.
Okay, it's
Right?
not descriptive in that
It is
sense.
not. It is also context agnostic. Nowhere in the text does he mention about the Mauryan Empire, for example, or a specific empire or specific.
It's for all.
Correct.
basically.
It is meant to be sort of a context agnostic sort of a set of ideas that Kautilya brought to the table.
Hmm.
I think that Kautilya, being how practical he is in his thinking, he would have only chosen some parts of these depending on the circumstances that was there. If he was the guy who was making decisions on, say, economic policy, right? You should also view that through that prism. This is not an encyclopedia of sorts. This could be a set of ideas that he's brought to the table, and he would sort of choose which of the ones that he wants to use. And so I think that the level of detail of these sort of punishments and things could be a bit more a bit more streamlined, I feel. But again, in his era, I don't know how severe or not severe it was in that context, in that era. We are comparing it to today's era. So, yeah.
I mean, given that the scope of the state today is much larger,
Yeah.
I mean, they can track everything, and in that time it was not the case.
Yeah, and see, now coming to the nanny part of it.
Yeah.
The thing is, see, an organized state needs to be detailed. If you're running the government today, you have to define every single layer of the government, because then it's not organized if you're not going to define. If you're not going to say, what are each of the components or each person, because it needs to be so encompassing, right? That there needs to be some definition for people to understand. So I don't have issues with these being so detailed. I look at the fundamental philosophy, the concept. What is Kautilya's fundamental philosophy? His philosophy is to ensure that the welfare of the people is taken care of. His philosophy is not sustaining the king.
Sustaining the kingdom.
Yeah, sustaining king of the kingdom. He says that the king is the servant of the people. In fact, again, I want to say this quotation, which is one of the main first quotations in the book. The reason I put it here is that Praja sukhe sukham rajnyaha prajanam cha hite hitam natpreyam hitam rajnyaha prajanam tu preyam hitam. So an approximate translation in English would be: a king's happiness lies in the happiness of his subjects, and his welfare in the welfare of his subjects. A king's welfare consists not in what pleases him, but in what pleases his subjects. This is the foundation of the arthashastra. Because he doesn't, if the king is not competent, if the king's progeny is not competent, he's saying he would be willing to even replace them so that you get competent people. So the focus is the welfare of the people. His focus is not to strangulate the people, which is what sort of a highly controlled sort of state would be, and then ensure that no matter what happens, the king survives. If that's the case, he wouldn't be saying this. Because he's a very shrewd political economist. Understand this. He's a multi-layered personality, right?
Absolutely.
He understood very well that the majority is always the lower half of the society. So unless their welfare, he might have a genuine interest in them. That could be a case, but there's also political interest. Because
that's what I said. Like sustaining the kingdom, king may be replaced, but kingdom has to go on.
Correct. So if someone's thinking, and you see that everywhere, the idea of Matsya Nyaya. What is Matsya Nyaya? Matsya Nyaya is basically the big fish eating the small fish, and he wanted to avoid that. So what is the logic again? The logic is again, you want the common man to sort of feel empowered, whether it's some legislation or whether it's some court ruling, some dispute. He wanted them to be empowered so that it doesn't happen. He wanted them to be given, say, targeted wealth transfers and things like that, so that inequality in society is not getting bigger.
And the labor contracts also.
Labor contracts.
Protecting the weaker sections of the society.
So
minimum wage is also a part of that.
Correct. And labor contracts. So what is he talking about labor contracts? He's saying that labor contracts need to be transparent, which means, let's say you go to a construction site. Okay? In a construction site, there are various types of laborers. He says that for each category of these laborers, you put a contract, a sample contract for people to see. So that is again empowering the individual. So when all of these policies are aimed at empowering the people, why would Kautilya want to strangulate them by, completely controlling them? Then he must be mad, no?
Yeah. I mean, if he's looking after their happiness, he can't be in a state of mind that I have to control these people, because then it comes the question of freedom. Without freedom, people can't be happy, truly happy.
See, if his main focus is to control people, then he should be saying that the king needs to have total control.
Yeah.
Right? That's not happening. I just showed to you that the king is considered just a servant. He's saying kingship can be replaced. Even in the kith and kin can be replaced. Okay? If the logic is that, no, he is, some sort of a psycho, he wants to, control everyone, then the welfare of the people will be affected. Meaning people will get fed up with this kind of, very anarchist state, which he doesn't want to do, because he clearly states in all these places how I've showed in your policies how he empowers people. So just because the state is detailed doesn't mean that it is a socialist or a state. You should look at the fundamental logic and thinking behind all these policies. The fundamental undercurrent that you see. That's why this book is important. Because no one, unless you bring all these ideas together, bring it together in a framework, and then debate the framework, you're not going to see the undercurrent of policy. Because the way the arthashastra is constructed is that for our understanding today, it's constructed in a different way. So you need to sort of extract that out and then show that underlying data. So my long answer to your small question is that just because the state is detailed doesn't mean that it is controlling.
It's in any state.
Yeah. Of course, he had spies, he had all these other guys for national security reasons. So that's another element completely. Purely on the economic side of things, I think his goal was on the welfare of the people and empowering people. That was something consistent.
There were no price controls, for example, that this thing might be sold for this much only, and if anyone tries to sell it above that, he might be punished.
Yeah, there were price controls. I mean, I'm not denying that. There were price controls. But I think he would not keep that as a status quo. I think there was a constant review of that process. For example, there were these decentralized statistic units, statistics offices in, say, villages, where basically people were employed to go and check in the villages in terms of price points, what is happening in terms of price controls and things. I mean, how the prices were varying, and just to get an idea of, say, inflation, like how we are seeing inflation, how we are measuring inflation, much more, say, primitive way of measuring. So he had a sense of all these things. But in some cases, of course, he imposed some of these controls, which is debatable, of course. And then in some cases, but in most cases, he sort of allowed the idea of the market to sort of take its own shape. Because if you really looked at some of his import policies, he gave a lot of exemptions for imports. He made them comfortable. He ensured that, traders, businessmen, needed to be happy, and content. Again, if it's coming back to the earlier point, if it's a highly controlled state, business wouldn't be thriving because they'll be highly suffocated, which wasn't the case because his focus was to sort of empower them. So
this is very interesting that there was a balance between keeping the business class happy, that they are remunerative enough so that they can invest and produce more and keep the productivity high, but also there is a welfare of the people in mind, which allows the state to check that there is no exploitation happening.
That's right.
That is something that is, I think, today, if we that something like that has not been achieved in a true sense, or we fail too many times.
No, I think that's a fair point. I mean, in terms of how he saw it, right? But he also believed that material, empowering businesses and commerce also empowers the lower sections of people in terms of opportunities.
Hmm.
So he also saw that element to
Hmm.
it, right? So at every level, his sort of thinking seems to me that it tries to empower people and sort of allow them to move up the ladder. And probably prosperity itself, because prosperity is sort of his main purpose of prosperity is for ensuring that lower sections of people grow, and also ensuring that a prosperous society is a politically stable society.
Hmm.
As an extension, the kingdom grows. So I think he saw it in both lenses.
So that he understood that that is an incentive, or the power of incentive has to work in an economy to thrive.
Correct. And that's why you don't see him, for example, giving doles to everyone.
Hmm.
You don't see him saying, even in fact, there are some of these labor contracts where Kautilya says that if you say the idea of tenure in today's parlance, say,
Hmm.
a professor becomes tenure, and then he or she has a job, say, for life. He says that even for people who sort of have a secure job, there has to be sort of some constant way to sort of assess their performance so that they don't slack off.
Hmm.
And there has to be sort of some level of skill upgrades so that people are provided, those sort of upgrades. On the other hand, people at the lower end of the spectrum, he also provides a lot of incentives to sort of encourage them to sort of grow and prosper.
One of the main essence that you talked about of Kautilyanomics is happiness of the people, and we talked about minimum wages. Now, if we give, for example, if today government announces that everybody has to implement some certain kind of minimum wages in throughout the country, people will be happy. But I mean, as so many studies have shown, that minimum wages are very harmful for the labor class, because eventually it increases the cost of business, and the people who would be employed at $10, for example, rather than $15, they would not be employed at all. So that factor comes in, and then we come to the other things. For example, should if there is something to be done for the benefit of the larger, for long term success of the state, or for the people, benefit of the people. For example, farm laws were implemented. They were very much, you can say, for the people, like for the farmers, for their benefit. The agriculture sector would have improved a lot if those reforms had gone through, but those were not allowed to implement. So things like that, like when you see that happiness, like people are protesting, they are not happy, clearly one section. But it can be larger, right? People are not happy with GST because they think that taxes are too high. So things like that, how do you keep a balance where you have to take certain decisions where people will not be happy? So how can you take, then that must not take precedence, because then the interest of the state, national interest, is hurt.
Okay. Yeah. See, I get your question. So again, the answer is going to be a bit complex, but
Sure.
the first part is Kautilya's theories or Kautilyanomics itself is not perfect at all.
Hmm.
Kautilya himself argues that. In fact, in the first few chapters of the book, if you had noticed, um, Kautilya himself says a lot of his ideas were from prior eras. This is from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and his sort of the arthashastra itself is sort of an amalgamation of a set of ideas together.
Hmm.
So he himself argues, saying, "I agree with Brihaspati on this. I might not agree with Shukracharya on this, and I might, agree with both of them on something else." So he's at a constant because he's a very practical economist, put it that way. So he's very open to change from whatever that I've seen. So he himself would agree that some of his ideas might not work in today's times. So this is not a template for a replica one-to-one. Okay? But what this does is, this shows that even during his time, he had a set of ideas which either are similar to conceptually to today's era, and he had a set of ideas and he had a thinking behind these ideas, not just some random ideas which just came out of the blue. And this thinking was a sort of a flexible, he was flexible about some of these ideas. It's not like he was very rigid saying this is how it should be. And there was also a framework to his thinking. So that's what we bring to the table. So there could be definitely a set of ideas which are not applicable in today's times for a variety of reasons. Technology, people, dynamics change, or whatever it is. On the point on happiness and the welfare, see, he's talking about net welfare. So he's not talking about, every policy of his should
make the people happy. Yeah.
He is, of course, pragmatic enough to understand that there might be certain things where he says that people might need to, sort of understand what the government is doing. But net, what is the welfare? Are they happy as a whole is what I think he would be looking at. Even the idea of taxation, right? He understood, for example, his average tax rate was about 17%. He had taxation for a variety of products. But if you look at his average rates, they range between 16 to 25% in average. If you put the longer and the shorter. If you look at nominal rates today, they are similar in bandwidth in terms of what we define as reasonable rates of taxation. So this is an example of an idea which he had before, which we even used in today's times. It might be a very simple idea.
I mean, 16% is very reasonable. But if you look at higher income folks, it goes to 35% also. In Western countries, especially in US, 40%, 35%. We had like 70% also at one point of time, 99% also. So 16% is very reasonable.
No, so
there is a question here.
Yeah, I'll complete this point. So what his argument of taxation is, say between 16 to 25 or 30%, that you go beyond a particular point, then people get annoyed. So that's why he brings the theory of honey and the bee theory, that beyond a point, if you go, then the threshold of people becomes lower, and then they get annoyed. So you have to be careful with how you sort of tax people. So again, look at the thinking. The thinking is to have some prescription, a policy, which he puts on the table, and then he has a sort of a quotation, sort of philosophy behind that policy, which is intrinsically flexible. It says, okay, I want to give you a range, between this range to that range, and even in this range, if people get pissed off for whatever reason, we got to be careful. So that's a thinking person. It's not a rigid personality. It's a personality that is thinking about consequences of policy actions and their impact on people, and having a mindset to sort of evolve. That is what we need to look at when assessing Kautilya, in my view.
I mean,
anyways,
you are saying that he's a very thinking person. I mean, I completely agree with you. There is a concept of Laffer curve in economics where you maximize the tax revenue. So in that sense, it's very technical concept. But Chanakya is thinking from the perspective of the people.
No, but in fact, Balbir ji in his book, Balbir Sihag ji, he has written an academic book much before me. And he's one of the, I would say, inspirations for me for the kind of work that he's done. He says that he argues the Laffer curve was actually Kautilya's curve in terms of...
That's what I was trying to ask. Like, did he go into those calculations also? Like, कहाँ पे किस कर्व पे या किस रेट पे हम मैक्सिमाइज कर सकते हैं.
No, but the thing is, he didn't explicitly say graphically interface that. I mean,
Yeah.
Barbiji
I mean-
tries to interpret it in that sense.
Okay.
And I think
But what is
that's-
the basis of that interpretation? कुछ तो मतलब उन्होंने सोचा होगा कि
No, I mean, the basis of that interpretation is similar to the Laffer curve in the sense that beyond a particular threshold, you're going to have counterproductive effects.
oh okay.
So,
Theoretically, that was the idea.
correct. I mean, see, but the challenge is, right, he's going to, Kautilya in the text is only going to give you the outcomes. The theory is, you got to backtrack to find the theory in some cases.
True.
So that's where the extraction becomes a very challenging exercise. So that's why you need to use techniques like Tantra Yukti and all this to sort of figure out what he's saying, the intent behind the thinking. So you just look at my approach to how I am conversing in this discussion. I always go back to what he's thinking.
Yeah. He must have studied so many kingdoms also. Like that some kingdom might be there and they are, for example, they might be charging 30%, but their size may be similar, but their income from the tax revenue might be less. So he might be thinking into those terms also. We have to factor in all those things.
Yeah, because what you're seeing is only the outcome, right?
Yeah.
See, if you take any textbook today in any subject, you would see theories and you would see the consequences of theories and how these theories were made. But here what we have is an outcome-based approach. So if you have to, so that's why it takes a lot of time, because if you have to look at what Kautilya is thinking, you need to first find consistent analytical points of his thinking. Right? We spoke about welfare. We spoke about empowerment. We spoke about Matsya, dealing with Matsya. We spoke about trade, sort of international approach. These are all consistent throughout the text in various layers. I mean, it might be sub-layer. You might have Matsya in, say, judicial contracts. You might have it in inequality, whatever it is. So, these sort of thought processes is what we need to analyze to figure out how the outcomes are how to interpret the outcomes itself. That is the challenge. Because if you merely look at the outcome of what he's saying, you're not going to see the layers behind it. So, so in that sense, I think I don't deal with taxation too much in the book because I just felt, that I didn't have that much space for another chapter on that.
But that would have been a kind of interesting topic to dwell on.
Yeah, that's true.
Everybody is interested in taxation.
Probably that's why I also avoided it also in a sense. But anyways, that's something I could have gone into. But even if you look at things like sustainable growth, right? That's another chapter because the reason why it shows sustainable growth and welfare is that it is far more contextual in terms of things like climate change, the environment, and all that. So I felt that relevance, people could relate to it more. So I sort of invested some time on it. But anyways, yeah.
I mean, as we were talking, like Dharmic principles, what could be the foundation principle? You said Dharma. And in Dharma, in Indian tradition, as Bibek Dev Roy ji writes in your introduction of the book, that community, for example, in Western world, they usually look at the individual and the state. The community part is very less talked about. In Indian tradition, that is not the case. Community has played a huge role. Society has played a huge role. Throughout the history, state has not been that much intrusive because society's size and role and importance in the individual's life and the communities has been very huge. So, did Kautilya factor in that while proposing his theories or his rules or his Dandaniti or all those things? Did he propose those while talking about all the economic principles? Was that a factor that some of these things will be taken care by the community?
It was. See, but one important distinction is that Kautilya didn't see an either or. He felt they were complementary. So the state had to be rule enforcing, and the responsibilities in society also existed, and each individual has their responsibilities played an important role. So that's where you see in sustainable growth, I talk about societal responsibilities, family responsibilities, and also other forms of responsibilities which drive societal sort of economic activity. He acknowledges these responsibilities and he sees them as complementary to each other,
Okay.
not either or.
Hmm.
Because often the debate goes between either responsibilities or the rule of law.
Yeah.
He finds that the rule of law is an important sort of, benchmark for society. But the rule of law, implementation of rule of law can be enhanced if these responsibilities are also further enhanced because they sort of complement it.
Hmm.
So, in that sense, he sees it sort of together. And the idea of responsibilities again, I've sort of looked at it from a sustainability growth angle because he believed that social responsibilities is important. So, for example, in say there is litter
Hmm.
in your compound or in your society, he believed that if there's a responsibility among the people in a particular colony, then that solves a lot of the hygiene problems, a lot of the issues that we have today. And this again comes from the idea of saucham, which is some sort of a cleanliness through another definition of dharma, which I give in the book.
Hmm.
It sort of triggers that. I mean, take the idea of Swachh Bharat itself today, right? Especially in rural areas, I think it sort of tries to trigger a sort of a dharmic consciousness in terms of how you want to be clean, because we're all clean within our houses. If you want to be clean outside, and if this is triggered, then people take more responsibility of the society around, and we have a cleaner society, and that leads to more, better outcomes, health outcomes, for example, as a consequence. So I think this could make policy, if there's an efficiency of policy through normal routes, say about 80%, these sort of nudges which I talk about, a lot of dharmic nudges, put it that way, could enhance the improvement of policy to say 90%.
Hmm.
Because what I think Kautilya tries to do is through the eye. He tries to bridge the gap between the policymaker and the cultural way of life that people are undertaking. So by doing this, it sort of bridges the gap a bit more. And if they're aligned, then policy becomes really effective. In some cases, he also tries to align them
Hmm.
in ways which can make it efficient. So rather than some imposition or some sort of a financial outcome determining action, your natural way of life and your purpose in life is fulfilled by this activity. If both the policy outcome is aligned to that, then the efficiency is far higher for that policy outcome.
That's very interesting because one of the things that you mention is that the usage and the attractiveness of gold, for example, in our society, and the fact that almost 75%, more than 75% of savings of our Indian households is into real estate. So can these, for example, a Kautilyan person who has that kind of economic thinking would align the policies of today's government, thinking that okay, I have to frame a policy thinking in the mind that real estate and gold are something that Indian people love, and I have to align my policies in thinking about those things, and then try to achieve the economic growth that I want to achieve using those things. So basically, studying the society as it is very important.
Or the other way around,
Hmm.
in the sense, if studying the society as it is very important, especially in a country like Bharat, because a large sections of economic decisions, whether we like it or not, is culturally driven.
Hmm.
And small economic decisions eventually map on to, say, an idea of the macroeconomy. So when you're micro decisions that you make are driven by certain factors, which in our case is also intertwined to culture. I mean, for different people, the percentages might vary.
Yeah.
But on an average, so then what happens is you have to have an understanding. So you're right on that part. But whether you want to align it to the cultural norms, or you want to enable people to sort of align to the policy that's being prescribed, that's for the state or whichever entity to sort of work on. But what I think Kautilya brings to the table is he tells that one has to be sensitive to these things and utilize them in a more constructive manner, right? And I think that is the point that we need to pick. So again, thinking behind Kautilya, what is his idea of responsibilities? He uses the idea of responsibilities as is to ensure sustainability is a sustainable environment, sustainable growth is taken, and welfare again reduces inequality and makes sustainable growth. So his thinking is along those lines. So it is again about recognizing that the society plays an important role in an economic activity, and how you sort of align either the policy or the social construct to make or to reduce the gap between the two. That is the thinking. So instead of, again, the policy prescriptions of Kautilya in his time, it'll be always useful to look at this thinking and then apply it to today's time.
Another.
So on the point, sorry to butt in. On the point of gold, for example, in the sovereign gold scheme, one of the main surveys which mentioned why the scheme wasn't too successful was that when people deposited their gold, they actually wanted the same gold back at the end of the maturity.
Yeah, emotional.
Because they have an emotional sort of
Yeah,
attachment. It's a very simple reason, but that was the number one reason, one of the top reasons why people sort of weren't attracted to the scheme. So these sort of nuances, being sensitive to it while making policy, vice versa, is what I think Kautilya is trying to get at.
And another aspect of Kautilyanomics or Kautilyan philosophy that differentiate him from, for example, what we were talking about earlier, Western notions today, that we were comparing that there are so many similarities. What differentiates that from Western philosophy is the rule of law we talked about. He agrees on that, but there are same rules are not applicable to everyone. So everybody is treated differently according to his capabilities, his resources. So one law does not apply, or one punishment does not apply to everybody. So that is another difference in his worldview.
Yeah, that's right. I haven't looked at that part of it too much, because my focus was mainly on the economics of contracts in terms of legal.
Even in economics, right? He treats so many sections of people differently from each other.
Yeah.
When it applies to applying rules.
No. I agree. But what I meant is in terms of the labor contracts and the contractual obligations, there is also an additional layer which you're talking about, which I didn't sort of go into. But that is one fair criticism of, I think, Kautilya, where in some cases it might be justified. But again, if sort of a uniform rule of law is what we define as, say, a norm, then that is something that we would, because there's a difference between uniform rule of law and uniform implementation of law. That is, there is a particular law, and then you implement the law, and then there's a uniform law for everyone, and then the implementation of it. But you're right, that is one angle which definitely I think Kautilya's views might...
I think that is, rather than criticism, I see it as positive of us, and rather the criticism of the Western worldview that we are today implementing.
Okay. Some people criticize, I have read some criticisms on that subject. But yeah, you're probably
And because everybody is not same, so you treating them equally is basically injustice, in my opinion. Of course, when it comes to implementation, there is a lot of that's when the problems start actually. uh, Wonderful book, wonderful discussion, and I think so many things that we have left because people should also read it. A very interesting thing that I liked is how relevant that you have made it for today's policymakers, that they can learn so many things. You give contemporary examples of so many schemes that the government is running or should run based on Kautilyanomics. So fantastic work, and what you are going to do next. And I listened to one of your interviews also, where you were mentioning that you are going to research further on this, and whether other kingdoms or whether other in the next centuries after Kautilya, so what kingdoms applied those principles to their kingdom. So that is something that I am personally very much looking forward to reading it. It's going to be very interesting. Thank you so much for coming, taking so much time out of your busy schedule. I know you are very busy. You came here to Delhi just for one day. So thank you so much. Wonderful book, and keep writing, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm glad you liked the book. For your listeners, I think Arihant read it in one shot
Yeah.
over the night, so that I take it as a compliment. Because it wasn't too boring for him.
No. It's very interesting, and people will relate to it a lot. And
Right.
everybody should read it. Everybody who's not even interested in economics, but interested in functioning of the society, functioning of the state, and interested in politics or economics or whatever, like how the country should be run. Everybody should take a look at it.
Yeah, I think my main purpose of the book when I started writing it is to exactly come to this sort of a, for an influencer such as you, after reading it, to sort of come to a conclusion which increases your curiosity. Because
Yeah.
eventually, what this book does is it brings Kautilya to the table on what his views could be on economics and finance. So there could be, I'm quite open, I say it in the book itself, there could be after 10 years, after further refinement of various reading other manuscripts, we might come to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
Right?
And one of the fantastic chapters is the last chapter, where you pose so many questions to Kautilya, that what would he think about all these issues that we are facing today. Artificial intelligence is one. So that those questions are very much relevant today. And I mean, I'm sure you are going to work on those. Like, what could be the way forward?
No, because I'm just an advanced learner
Yeah.
compared to the reader, right? And I'm also making an attempt to sort of use various techniques to distill the thought process of a guy who was thousands of years before us, right? But the reason why I put in the chapter is to sort of highlight the thinking again. I'm again going into thinking of Kautilya. I think where we missed the point is that we are always focused on outcomes. He said this, he said that. If you like him, you say 10 things that he said. If you don't like him, you say 10 things that he said. If you're in between, you say things that he didn't even say. So,
True.
but what is useful is, the thinking behind what made him think that way. So once you start questioning yourself on that, then it's a different process.
Then that's where the search begins for real answers.
That is where, the benefits come, whether you want to apply it for today or not, because you're focused on thinking.
Yeah.
So once you're focused on the thought process, then you can tweak the thought process to whatever that you want to tweak in policy.
Yeah.
So there
that's
is
why finding the foundation principles, dharma,
correct.
that is at the root of it. Then that is very useful for us.
So the last chapter is actually a sort of that's how I approach every chapter. Put it that way.
Yeah.
So these were questions which I constantly keep asking to understand what he would have thought. Because, like you said, you were asking me many questions across the book. But in each of these layers, there is a level of consistency which I've already thought about.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to explain that to the best of my ability. But that ability for me to show that consistency is because of answering these questions over many years, trying to refine the logic and trying to see how he would have approached.
Yeah.
Because we are not saying that he's a perfect person, because we are acknowledging, he himself acknowledges that there are a lot of flaws that he has, right? The question really is, how do we have a constructive dialogue based on this?
True.
And how do you have a constructive dialogue based on, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? I'm a human being, you're a human being. Same thing would have happened thousands and thousands of years ago. And human beings are the ones who are making economic choices. It might be primitive agriculture, agriculture is not primitive, but it might be a primitive choice, or it might be a complex choice that you make due to a variety of circumstances. But eventually we are human beings. So these behavioral choices that human beings make could become relevant even today, because at the end of the day, we are still human beings.
Yeah.
So that is why the thinking behind his ideas is important, is to get a sense of that. And once one sort of debates and discusses that, then it makes, first of all, appreciating his worldview easier, and also trying to contextualize it to today's times.
And what's more important is that people who think, who read it, who watch this episode and many other interviews that you have done, that they also start thinking and doing some work approaching these old texts of ours. So that is something that a lot of work needs to be done in this regard.
Yeah, in fact, that's why I keep, telling people, whomever who write to me, that please go review the book.
Yeah.
Either in your blog or on Amazon or whatever it is.
So that a discussion can be started and more and more people can be exposed to these ideas.
Exactly. And there has to be, lawyers looking at the legal side of Kautilya.
Yeah.
There has to be engineers looking at, what he suggested in some of these texts. And there has to be foreign policy folks who talk about foreign policy.
Yeah, but they should all read Kautilya first. That is the condition.
It's a multi-dimensional personality.
Because too many people are quoting Chanakya or Kautilya without reading.
Correct. So so my urge to your listeners is, please read the book, debate, discuss. If you have any ideas, please, you can reach out to me.
Yeah.
And hope that this sort of brings a different dimension of Kautilya to the table for people to discuss.
I'm sure it will. Can you show the book cover again?
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Sure. Namaste.
Namaste, sir.